It's an honor to be here this morning to give you your first look at the value study, which will be more important in many ways than you might have thought when you joined the partnership that funded it. In fact, it will have a direct connection to much of what you just saw. Now, this is a true partnership. It's a partnership between the Central Florida Foundation, the Central Florida Partnership, and MetroPlan. And we kind of set this up so that the managing partner of the partnership was Jacob Stewart at the partnership, and then Harry and I worked with Jacob all through this process, and our boards of directors have worked together to make certain that the funding partnership put together all of the components of this. But I want to give you just a little bit of context about why this is important. Now, some of you were in the room several months ago. Many of you who weren't in the room have seen this bullseye before. We brought community leaders from across the 7-county region together at Howey in the Hills several months ago. And we asked that 11 core issues in the region that had leadership and scorecards come together for a 2-day discussion. Now, what that meant was these 11 issues that we talked about were all things that people thought were important. They're all equally important, and they're very diverse. They range from transportation and water to things like racial relationships, investing in people, what we can or should be doing about decreasing poverty in the economy around the region, dealing with homelessness. And over the 2-day process, these issues were discussed and, in essence, scorecarded so we could see how we were doing across the region in all of these issues. And then we used a statistical analysis called a paired comparison or a source problem analysis to try to figure out if all of these things were equally important, what were the source dilemmas? What were the things that, if they were solved, would open the door and create a pathway to solve many of the other things, as opposed to taking them one by one based on the will of the people in the room? That source problem analysis brought us to 3 dilemmas, and they are in the middle of this bullseye. Those 3 dilemmas were, first, not being certain who we actually are in Central Florida. Now, that doesn't mean we were having self-esteem issues and we couldn't figure out whether we liked each other. What it meant was we're not a community that has a general connection based on what we do here or who we are. In fact, it was very clear that most of us are here individually, entrepreneurially, to be who we are and pursue what we do. So we're not the strongest social capital region in the marketplace across America. That's not a negative. The positive side of that is we get a lot of things done independently, but we don't have that connection. The second issue was we weren't really sure who was responsible for things. And what that means is, those of you as elected officials know that the public sector has some responsibilities, but you also know that many of your constituents think the public sector has responsibility for things that it doesn't actually have responsibility for. People think the private sector does things the private sector doesn't actually do. And so not knowing really who we are and not being sure who is responsible for what, from our position at the Central Florida Foundation, an understanding of who's responsible has to do with driving philanthropy and capital investment in quality of life projects across the region. It's hard to get to things like homelessness, how we solve transportation, what we do about water and other things if we're not sure who we are and we don't really know who's responsible for things. The third source dilemma was transportation. Now, you might find this interesting that of these dilemmas, the first 2 seem kind of hard to get your hands around because you're not really sure what that equates to. How would you measure it? What does it look like? Transportation came down to not transportation, but the question of how we fund transportation. It's ongoing, sustainable transportation systems. And so these source dilemmas clearly showed us that if we solved these 3 problems, we would open the door and speed up the solutions to lots of those other problems. It's hard to figure out what we do about race relations and homelessness if we're not sure who we are, who's responsible, or we can't figure out how to get people who need jobs to the places where they're going to have those jobs. So these 3 issues opened the door to the big question, and this is the traditional question in Central Florida. We could have ended this leadership process these many months ago, shared all of the information out of this process, which we did. People took it, used it to create partnerships. But in the old days where we would come together, think something up, and then go out and tell everybody what we found out, we recognized that what we were missing were the answers to these 3 questions. And so that took us to a man named Dr. D. Allsop, who's no stranger to this community and no stranger to you. He was part of myregion.org's How Shall We Grow project. When we had to figure out how are we going to deal with growth in Central Florida over the long range, the first question was, how do people really feel about it? Now, as elected officials, you see a lot of political research. This is polling to figure out how people feel in the moment in time when you ask them a question about whether you're going the right way or the wrong way. but understanding the feelings and values that our constituents across the region have, how they come to these decisions, how things that are transactional they may not even understand actually impact the way they feel about the life they lead. This becomes an area of interest to all of us, because if we can figure out how to engage the people who care about things through their values, and how to have conversations and educate people who may not understand things by talking to them in language that they understand, not the transactional understanding of money and how we build things, then we might be able to move this process forward. Dr. Allsop brought to the table some very unique methodology and a way to look at things. The first thing I want you to understand about the methodology here is it's not a poll and it's not a survey. This isn't a thing that we bring out some data and show it to you, then it goes in a book and we put it on the shelf, we don't worry about it. In essence, what we've learned from this advanced methodology in this study will fuel lots of things going on in the private sector, the public sector, and the independent sector for the next decade. It will not only give us tools to go to the marketplace and understand how our constituents feel and talk to them about some of the very funding issues that you've just been presented, but it also gives us an understanding of how they really feel outside of a political circle, outside of a money circle, but in the circle of how transportation relates to their quality of life. So you're going to get a very special early pre-release look at the transportation side of this study today, but I would urge you to be around on June 19th for the entire study's release, because on that date you'll see how all of these things fit together and how this bullseye not only drives transportation, but it makes transportation a lot more important than just the transactional piece of how much it costs and how long does it take to do it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. D. Allsop from Heart+Mind Strategies, who will take you through this pre-release data.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, board members. It's good to be back. Actually, I don't know if you remember, but I was here in December of 2011, and I came and spoke to you about successful communications campaigns and public transportation, some of the elements that go into that, and it's great to be back. And of course, as Mark mentioned, I was very involved throughout the years of my region and kicking that off, and do a lot of this type of work around the country. And I should also mention that I do work for the American Public Transportation Association, have helped them over the last decade in framing their messages to people who don't ride or use public transportation, but trying to make them understand and value the proposition that they still benefit from it and therefore should be willing to tax themselves to fund it. So I'm very familiar with the issues that you face, and it's a privilege to be with you here today. One of my favorite sayings comes from a biologist, very obscure, but I like the saying anyway. That is that the most powerful factors in the world are clear ideas in the minds of energetic people of goodwill. And I see you as members of this board as the energetic people of goodwill, and I see my responsibility here is to provide some clarity around some ideas that might be useful in the doing of your jobs. So it's great to be here with you. As Mark mentioned, we were looking at several different issues in this piece of research that we've done for the region, and we're actually going back and we're updating work that was done originally for my region and looking at the values and the things around which people organize their lives. They're kind of core principles around why they come here, what they love about this place, and what it is that drives and frames their decision making. But in working towards going out with the major piece, this is kind of 3 phases of work that we've done. The first phase was to first make sure we understood how people, at least a lot of the leaders across the region, were looking at these issues. And so we did a number of interviews, one-on-one, and Harry and Jacob and Mark helped facilitate me finding folks who deal with these issues on a regular basis from independent, public, and private sector to get their framing of it and help guide some of our inquiry. Those are some of the individuals you see in front of you who helped me to do that. With that, we then went with some other sophisticated tools that we use for interactive collaboration. And some of you may have participated in that as well. I know some of the members in the audience here did. I recognize their faces, in which we had 3 sessions with stakeholders, over 150 people from across the region. And I should just mention that the region we're looking at expands around beyond the borders of MetroPlan. It's a 7-county region, and we had mayors, planners, school teachers, board members of school boards. They had all kinds of folks from around the region who provided some input in these stakeholder audiences to guide us. And then we also included some interviews with these collaborative sessions with residents. And it's been my experience that residents often have a different point of view than the leaders of their community. And so we use this as a way to kind of keep us true. And sure enough, they taught us a few things that even howling the hills, and amongst those 11 items in that bullseye, there were some items very big that were left off. And so they gave us some good reminders about what matters in this region, and that we may be focused on some things, but if we're not focused and understanding the things they're focusing on, they're gonna feel like we don't understand them, and you don't get us, and therefore why should I listen to you? So they've helped reorient us in some important ways. But the third phase, and the phase now that I'm going to be sharing you with results with, deals with this 7-county region in which we interviewed over 1,000 people. And it's important for us to get to a point to where the results we're doing are not just subjective to the few people who we happen to contact, but we approach it in a scientific way, with a scientific sample that's representative in a true nature to the people who actually live here, and a sufficient size that we have a degree of confidence that it is representative. And we modified the design so that we'd get at least 75 interviews in each of the counties, and then beyond that, we kind of let where the people live drive where the additional interviews came from, and we found that to be fairly useful. There's one thing on this chart I'll point out to you that is kind of unusual in terms of an interview that typically you guys are familiar with, and that is the length of this interview. The average length of this interview, the average length that a person participating in this was 28 minutes. Now, how in the world you get somebody to be willing to take 28 minutes to do an interview? The reason and the answer is pretty simple. This is something they care about. This is their region. This is their quality of life. This is their opportunity to give you input on what matters. And so in my mind, it's a testament to the fact that they care about these things, that they gave that much of their time to be able to participate and to give us feedback. So today I'm going to share with you an abbreviated version, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the who we are in terms of just some comparisons of people in this region, how they're feeling, how things are going. But I'm going to focus primarily on the investing in regional transportation section of it because of the nature of your responsibilities. So I'm just going to give you a heads up that some of the most interesting pieces we're not going to be getting in today. I'm not going to show you the mind map of people in Central Florida. I'm not going to be sharing with you this look that we have that's never been done in any region that I've been involved with, where we look at the priorities, but then we break it down into public perception of who's responsible, independent, public, or private sector. And I think those provide us important inputs in terms of, okay, here's where people's minds are, and here's where they put these priorities. And so it gives us a good strategic implications about what we need to be doing for each of these individual priorities who have their own constituencies and stakeholders related to them. That won't be shared today, but I want you to know that that's available, and that'll be a part of this that we share when you all come on June 19th to the forum. So let me go ahead and share you some things that give you some insight to your region. A very simple way that we look at quality of life is we put people on a ladder. In the interview, we give them the opportunity to say, on this ladder of life, where 0 represents the worst quality of life, 10 represents the best, where would you place yourselves? And that middle ladder represents where folks of this region put themselves, a little over 7. You may not recognize it, that's pretty darn healthy. In America, you're a full point below that. About 6.1 is where America places themselves on the quality of life. This shows and confirms through other things that we have here that people come here and live here because of high quality of life. All the types of things that they can do here, all the wonderful amenities that are provided and afforded here. That's part of what makes this place special. That's part of who you are. And so it's higher than it is across the nation. As you might expect, it's better than it was 5 years ago, and people expect and anticipate that it'll be better 5 years from now. And so those are all positive things that reflect on your region. We also ask people to reflect on this idea in terms of the quality of life. Is it increasing or is it decreasing? And within the region here, you've got about 2/3 who feel like their quality of life is in a state now where it's increasing. That would not have been the case a few years ago, And it's far higher than what it is nationally. When I asked this question in other regions and nationally, only about 40% or so are feeling like their quality of life is currently increasing. So you're a bit of the head of the curve in terms of recovery and people feeling like things are getting better in the region. In addition, we ask a question that you see in a lot of other types of work, and it's a common frame that I like to ask as well. Do you feel like things are headed in the right direction or wrong track? And it provides a good context. And when you ask that question nationally, you only get about 30%, 32% who feel like our nation is headed in the right direction. If you ask that question to people who live in your region, you're getting over 60% who feel like things are headed in the right direction here. So very positive feelings about where you're headed. And then we also say of all the things that affect your quality of life, what balance of them are positive versus what balance are negative? And there's a good balance leaning heavily on the positive elements of quality of life. And I would have expected that if we had done this in the height of the growth back 10 years ago in my region, that this number would have probably been up in the 70s in terms of overall positives. But there are some things right now affecting your region, and I'm sure you're all aware of them, that are making people still worry about negative impacts on quality of life. And I'll show you some of that in just a minute. So particularly, it has a lot to do with the economy and whether or not people feel like the local economy is strong, weak, or somewhere in between. Most people, 2/3, feel like we're still somewhere in between. We're not as weak as what we were, but we're definitely not strong. Overall, if you look at, take out the people who say we're just about the same, you just look at the weak, the strong, the balance is largely to the weak side by about 5-1. And so mostly that's, we're about in between, but people on the whole still feeling like there's some economic recovery that needs to happen. But if you look over on the right side, there's a lot of folks in terms of where they see it. The indicators are right, the momentum's right in terms of improving this local economy by more than 2-1 in terms of improving versus getting worse. And so there's some momentum building, there's some optimism building amongst the public in terms of where they see and feel like things are going. And it seems to be a little bit ahead of what other data that I'm seeing in other parts of the nation. So what is it that's driving these perceptions? And here's where we get into kind of the deeper aspects of what it is that matters to people and their individual lives. We've looked at this in different ways, and I'm going to be sharing the one that focuses on your personal life. We also look at this from a regional perspective. But we asked it in what's impacting the region. What I'm sharing with you now is what in your own personal life has the greatest impact on your quality of life. And the potential things that they could tell us here was developed based on all these interviews that we did in the phase 1 and phase 2, and kind of made it to a list from which people could then pick. And the biggest factor driving quality of life currently, as you might expect, it relates to economic and employment opportunity. And for the predominant number who are picking that, that's a negative concern. That is a worry. There's about 1 out of 5 of your residents. That is their primary concern, and it's mostly negative. Beyond that, the next most important priority is safety and security. And that was not even on the list of Howing the Hill items and priorities for the region. And this is one when Harry and I were driving around doing these things, we talked about this, and this was one thing where I told Harry, based on other work, I expect that this is going to be showing up. And Harry, you might comment about this, but Harry wasn't so sure about that and didn't feel like that was a big issue here. But sure enough, we saw this coming up pretty significantly. And I just do feel a responsibility for you all to recognize that it is a big priority. And when we ask people what's the most important regional priority rather than personal priority, it's number 1. And so there is an issue related to a sense of safe communities that people are concerned about that needs to be addressed. Third most important personal priority, and I don't find this in many regions, that a personal priority, number 3 on the list, is traffic congestion. So that means that the issues you're dealing with touches a lot of lives, and you'll notice that these bars are red and green. Red means a follow-up question, is it mostly having a positive impact or is it having more of a negative impact? Red means obviously negative. And so this is a negative concern. It's a big negative concern of that. And why is that the case? Because you're going to see in this next series of things, here's all the things that people love about this region. There's so many things to do here. There's so many local amenities. There's so many people that I love that are close by here. I have great health care in the region that I have access to. And all the things that are located nearby and easily accessible, even down the outdoor opportunities, the beaches, things like that, the theme parks, all these wonderful amenities. But traffic is my barrier. Traffic is the thing that gets in the way of me enjoying what it is that's great about this place. So when you think about traffic, you begin to get a framework for what it's about. It's not just about the congestion, it's what it prevents people from being able to do. And that's preventing them from do all the things and having the time to do things that they care more about and the reasons that they're here in this very region. I will point out just a couple of other items that are on this list. You'll notice it is a very diverse list here. The top three are the ones I think that matter the most. They're sizable, in which we took deeper dives in. I won't be sharing it with you today, but we've done a deeper kind of values laddering on the personal, emotional drivers of each of those issues. We have mind maps on driving those and how to communicate with them on them. I will point out, third from the bottom there, the lack of investment in public transportation did make the list. And in my mind, that's actually pretty significant that it would actually make this list. I don't often see it making a list of regional priorities, but it does make the list. And so that, even though it's only 2%, the fact that 2% of the population say that is their most important personal priority, you know, that's pretty significant to me. So I just wanted to point that out. When we showed you regionally quality of life, you remember I showed you this, the balance of positive and negatives was 60% positive, 40% negative. When we put it on a personal level in terms of your quality of life, not quality of life in the region, it's much more balanced in terms of almost equally positive and equally negative. Which the story is, people see things happening and moving in a positive direction in the region. They're not quite out there yet with their own lives. They're still struggling there. There's still issues that need to be dealt with. And that's clearly coming through in what we're seeing. Okay, so I want to transition now and focus on your area of interest, and that's in regional and investing in regional transportation. And I'm just going to give you a heads up that about midway through this conversation about regional transportation, we're going to shift and we're going to focus on public transportation. And so I just want to give you a heads up about that and how we do that. And we didn't want to take anything for granted. We all assume people care about investing in transportation. You're obviously organized for the purpose of making transportation possible for people throughout the region. It's kind of an existing assumption of yours. But you know, you're not going to have success unless you're working on assumptions that are based in truth. And so we've gone out and just asked some very simple questions. Investing in regional transportation is an important priority for our region. Do you agree with that or not? And in fact, we find that 4 out of 5 agree with that. And you've got 1 out of 4 who are strong believers, a strong core advocacy group in terms of investing in regional transportation. But overall, this matches a lot of what I see nationally. This is almost exactly the same result as what I see in other, across the nation. It matches pretty close. It's not higher, it's not lower, it's about exactly the same. So what are the priorities that people see as they relate to regional transportation? This is one that surprised me, and it's one that I don't often see, and that's a recognition and appreciation amongst the general public that the maintenance is the biggest priority. Typically, I'll see more attention around investing in rail or some of the other types of expanding of services. But in your region, there's a high appreciation, recognition that the biggest priority is the maintenance and repair of existing roads and infrastructure. So this is like a 1 to 10 scale. The higher the importance and priority, the higher the score you would get it. And then I see what I normally would see closer to the top, improving or expanding public rail or improving, expanding public bus transportation. So those are the second and third priorities. And then investing in expanding new local roads and highways, that's a little bit lower, 6.1, and improving biking and pedestrian trails, 6.0. So those are a little bit lower. Now we transition a little bit and Do you support or oppose the allocation of your local tax dollars toward the expansion and improvement of public transportation services in your community? So we're moving now into a focus on public transportation. And we normally give them a little definition that lets them know that this is related to bus and rail rather than the roads. And as you'll see here, 3 out of 4 people agree with that. Again, you get a core strong group, about 1/5 in this case, who are strong supporters of public transportation, 1 in 4 who don't feel like that should be a priority. So the follow-up question, naturally, that this begs is, should the level of investment be increased or decreased? And the majority of people, 50%, saying that the level of investment in public transportation should be increased. And the second highest category, those who say it's just about right, should be kept the same, about 38%. I like to look at these things by taking out that kind of middle or neutral group and looking at the relative weight on the 2 extremes, on those who say increase versus those who say that it should be decreased. And you've got 4-to-1 ratio there. That tells me where the momentum and where the lean is in the region, and it's 4-to-1 leaning in favor of further investment in public transportation. Okay, so where does that money come from? And this is the real nut I think this group has often struggled with. And this is a question I don't think often gets asked in a region, because we often see people say we need to invest more. But here we're saying, okay, you can invest more in 2 ways. You can take it away from existing services that are being provided by the current level of taxation, or from the other point of view, you can say we don't feel like we can take from those other services, and in fact we need to go out and, as it says here, in order to secure the necessary funding to improve public transportation, a small tax increase of some kind would be required, where we're basically giving them the option of reallocating existing or going out and taxing for additional. And you can see it's very evenly divided. 43% say that we should just reallocate from other sources, with 38% saying that we should go out and go find new additional sources. So the way I look at this is you have a solid third, almost 40% in your region, which is actually not an insignificant number, who's a core base who's behind go finding new sources to fund public transportation. And but it's clearly, as I know you're facing, and some of the efforts and initiatives out there, there's not a majority of public support inherently in going and finding new sources. And that's the issue I know you're dealing with. And then we get into specific types of sources. And here we ask people 2 questions. We ask them, there are a variety of different sources in which funding could come from. How effective do you think each of these would be? And that's that dimension that you'll see from left to right. And which of these would you most prefer? And that's the dimension that we see going north to south on this chart that I have in front of you. And the one that is head and shoulders above all the other options is, let's put a $2 tax on all the rental cars of all the people coming to visit this place, and that'll fund our transportation needs. 70% have that as their most preferred. 80% think that's going to be the most effective. So folks in this room obviously know that's not going to take care of the problem. That it's a clear misperception that out in the public, 80% of them believe that's the most effective means of doing it. So if it's not, there needs to be some education and letting them know that that's not going to do it. But they believe by a far amount that is going to be the most effective way to deal with their needs to be able to accomplish the goals that they have. When I look at this chart, the one that I find most interesting is what comes in second place. Something that does not even exist, but something for which amongst the public there's a high degree of support, and there's a perception of amongst the majority of them that it would be the most effective. And that's implementing a new regional sales tax for transportation. 50% believe that would be effective, and that's a starting point. I don't think there's been a lot of conversation about that. And so it's kind of a natural starting point that is there without a lot of education, without a lot of promotion or discussion around it, that's already there. So that would indicate to me that that's a seed around which something might be developed. Other work that I've done in other regions shows that people feel that a shared responsibility, shared effort is always safer from a political point of view and from a kind of we all benefit from this, the boat that rises lifts us all point of view, and there's a kind of a natural feeling of how and why that works. Other items, raising tolls on existing roads, that came in number 3. About half people think that'll be effective. About 38% think that is their most preferred, or they would prefer that. Raising a county sales tax, increasing the number of toll roads. Least favorite is, and we often see this, is raising property tax. Raising gasoline tax is a little bit lower than I think I've seen on other studies. I think one that was done by University of Central Florida, Jim Wright, I think had that coming a little bit higher than what we saw in this study here across the 7-county region. What I wanted to wrap up with is ways to talk about transportation, and we just wanted to get a sense, given people support public transportation in the large numbers that we saw, 80% overall, regional transportation, 70% on the public transportation. So if that's the case, then how do you talk about it in a way that people reflects how they feel about it? And we tested a variety of different approaches. And you'll notice that on all of these, there's a very high degree of agreement, 78% up to 85% of the ones that I'm sharing you here. This idea that it allows me to spend more time for important priorities, such as time with family and friends, and 80% agreeing with that, 85% that transportation is for the benefit of people who cannot afford to own or operate a car. 85% were agreeing with that, 40% strongly agreeing with it. It connects and creates vibrancy in communities. 78%, 85% agreeing with the message that I've tested a lot with ABTA, that for every dollar that's spent returns $4 in economic gains in the region. That 85% feel like that's a very important reason why public transportation matters. What I've saved for the last here are 2 items around which you're in the area of apple pie. This is the core. If you can get agreement amongst 90% of Americans, this is Americana and apple pie in terms of a core way of framing an issue. And here are those 2 items. The first one uses a technique that I've seen in a lot of effective communications. It is an introductory thing that makes everybody kind of buy in because it applies to them. And it's this introductory phrase of, while not all of us use public transportation, it benefits us every day. And this is an important thing that I've seen work in the work that we do for APTA at the national level. It gets people who aren't using or riding public transportation recognize that, oh, you are talking to me, I should be listening because I do recognize there are benefits. And then it goes in and outlines what those benefits are. It drives economic growth and good paying jobs. Most importantly, it helps give people vital connections to jobs and opportunities that improve their quality of life. 45% strongly agree with this. Overall, 93% agreeing with it. But look at the second item here. Much shorter, much more concise, much more simplified, and you're getting 92% agreement with it. And it simply states the fact that people, and resonates well with them, that public transportation ensures everyone has reliable transportation and connect people with their jobs and their community. And given what we saw was the most important priority at a personal level for the region, which was jobs and economic opportunity, is it no surprise that that's the benefit that you're talking about that resonates with most people in terms when you're talking about public transportation for the region. So I think that this begins to paint a picture of the dynamics that underlie public feelings about regional transportation in your region as well as public transportation in the region. I wanted to end because I know there's representation from a variety of regions here, show you a little bit about the fact that this doesn't vary much by where you come from in the region. And I'm looking at some of those core questions. Is it a regional priority? And you can see it's a low of 70% in Brevard County, which is probably one of the more, outside the core in terms of, geographically placed. But 70% nevertheless agreeing. Highest, 87% in Osceola County. But all of the ones are in the high 80s otherwise. So it's not like you're finding a lot of highs and lows across the different counties. and support allocation of tax dollars toward expansion and improvement of public transportation. The low, Brevard County, 67%, the high, Seminole County, of 81%. And then that other question about where the money should come from, is it from reallocating dollars from existing funds, or should we go out and get additional funds? You remember that was pretty close overall. And what you do find is a little variation. You find Osceola and Seminole, actually, a preponderance of people on the side, let's go out and get some additional funds to take care of these needs. And so overall, consistency across the regions and a few counties in which you get a little bit leaning in towards some, where that money's going to come from. And at this point, Mr. Chairman, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you and see if there are any questions.
Questions? It seems to me that we keep going back to quality of life improvement or enhancement. And unfortunately, I think most of the time we're discussing dollars. When we're in our discussions and Harry's got the spreadsheets and it's all about dollars. And maybe we need to shift our focus a little bit more toward quality of life. And when we're having a discussion about either mass transit or our regular roadway needs. I'm guilty of that myself. And just listening to this tells me I'm approaching it wrong.
Mayor, I think you're right, because it's all about mission. Getting the right word out, getting the right message out. I think you're truly absolutely on point.
Mr. Chair, will this draft be available on MetroPlan's website?
On the 19th, it becomes public available, and it'll be all over. And it'll be up to Harry about how you use that, June 19th.
In other words, between now and then, we won't have an opportunity to go through it again?
I don't believe so.
Any other comments? Dr. D, I have a couple of questions for you. I understand that in your research, safety and security was an item that the public says needs to be addressed. How much of that is really perception, and how much of that is really involves around incidents or actual? The reason why I say that is because the news media, sorry, Mayor. Every time you put on the radio or the television, watch the news, I very rarely see a good news story. If there's out there, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Well, let me just mention quickly, we've gone back and we've looked at the statistics. And this region actually is above national averages on violent crime and other issues. Okay. And so I would say it would be incorrect to believe that it's strictly being driven by perceptions that the news generates.
That's why I'm asking.
The news reports real things. They may spend more and disproportionate amount of time on it, and they may accentuate it, but I think it would be wrong to assume that people do not feel like this is an issue or that it's being driven by the media and therefore does not need to be addressed. I just think that would be the wrong conclusion to take from this.
After the 19th in June, when you present to us, as everything becomes out in the open, not that we're hiding anything, but we as individuals be able to drill down to your data to see exactly what's actually going on with some of this information?
Yes. In fact, the plan is that, we focused on 3 issues. We think there's broad applicability on these to a broader set of issues that were in that kind of bullseye that Mark showed to you. Knowing what people's priorities are provides a framework for you to talk about any one of these issues. Because if you know what they care about, you know where your starting point is in the conversation with them, even if it's on homelessness or whatever the issue may be. So we think there's a lot of things there. And on each of these issues that were on that list that I showed you that people chose what's important in their personal life, we can break down and show you how that varies by county. We can show you the people who were saying that, like homelessness, was their #1 issue. We can get those profiles for you. All that will be available.
I also want to thank not just yourself, but Mark and Jacob, as well as Harry, who put this all together. Jacob, I can't thank you enough for taking
Well done.
part in this. Jacob, before we close, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, sir. I just, Dr. Allsop will be presenting some information to folks from the foundation this afternoon, and then we'll be doing another presentation tonight, and then we'll kind of close down a little bit until we get to the 19th. But Fred, on your question, our first presentation was to the staffs of MetroPlan, to the foundation, and to the partnership, and that ran just about 4.5 hours. So, and that really wasn't as in-depth. This research is I would say it's much more meaningful than anything we've presented before. Although 100 communities have now gone to market since my region, where we were the second, I think, to do this. We're the first community to go back to market. And so this is really an exciting time to learn about what 4 million people are thinking about the future, because that's the size of the market we're talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Henley?
Mayor, just a moment ago, mentioned something that's quite often kicked about, what this really is about, to a large degree, in every elected official at this table. I'm sure in their campaign talked about quality of life. That's what I'm for. But we never define what we mean by the quality of life. And there are 5 or 6 factors that, to me, affects the quality of life there. But we need to be talking to those and relating to these. To me, quality of life is heavily impacted by the infrastructure that we have, the ability to move people and freight, etc. It also is impacted heavily by a good education system, high-paying jobs there, recreational amenities, and those types of things. And a lot of people don't think about that when they think about the quality of life, particularly those that are struggling, to get by hand to mouth. And I think it would help us to relate to people to understand what we mean about the quality of life and how these things that we're advocating here impact the quality of life. I think it would relate a lot better on the mission that we're all on, and that's try to improve the quality of life. But what particularly is our targets there? And transportation, of course, is most of them recognize. But rarely when we talk about quality of life, do we mention safety, those types of things. And I think we need to do it more often in trying to sell this to the people of the region here. Because if we simply major on transportation alone without helping them to understand how that impacts the quality of life better than they already do, I think we'd be ahead of the game. But we fail to do that quite often. We just, quality of life, I'm for that, but everybody's for that. But what do we need?
Any other comments?
Commissioner, can I just respond to that very quickly? You're exactly right, Commissioner Henley. And in fact, it's most effective if, rather than you all telling them what quality of life means, is you allow them to tell their stories about quality of life. And you do it in a way that you're facilitating that story to be told. And because what's been demonstrated in some of the most sophisticated communications and campaigns is storytelling. And storytelling by those who are actually the people who are having that. And the degree that you can begin to think of how you can allow people to tell their stories and as they relate to the actions that you're taking big steps.
Mr. Chairman, I'll give you a story. I'm out there always talking to Seminole County residents, talking about transportation, and he was telling me about how lucky he was. He works in downtown Orlando from Oviedo, that he's catching all of these green lights in his commute time to downtown Orlando because he refuses to pay tolls. That's his prerogative. How lucky he is to catch all these green lights driving to downtown Orlando and how his commute has been reduced. I had to explain to him that he was not lucky. It is because of the decisions and the votes that this elected board has made to spend the money to time all of those traffic lights with advanced computer systems so that during the commuting hours, you can make it places here that 3 or 4 years ago you could never make it to in a reasonable amount of time. This board makes decisions that make this community better. And that story never gets out. You gentlemen need to, it's not advertised, but you need to communicate to the public. You're making these decisions that they make their quality of life a lot better. That message is just not getting out.
Mr. Hanlon, you're absolutely correct, as well as Commissioner Henley is, that we're not telling our story. Any other comments? Mayor?
Speaking as a former public relations professional, I wish I had a nickel for every time somebody said, we need to do a better job telling our story. It's just incumbent upon us to tell the story, and I'll spend some time later standing up for the news media and the news business, but it's not the news media's job to tell the story of why we need to invest more in public transportation. It's our responsibility.
Mayor, I would agree with you, and it's also the news media to tell the story, not fabricate the story. Not tell the story. I'm not picking on any news media that's any other.
Yeah, be careful about that.
Even in general. Half of a headline is the worst thing you can actually get. Any other comments?
Thank you,
Doctor, I can't
thank you,
thank
Mr.
you
Chairman.